to start? Great. Hi, everybody. So we wanted to focus this session on SQL and FHIR and OMOP. So Nikolai is going to be leading that session. He has a couple of topics. So does John. So I'll be taking a step back, but I think right here at the beginning, let's just go over some of the current outstanding items. I don't think we have that many, but please speak up. So if you take a look at the Zulip thread tracking the current to-do, we have a couple of things Ryan has been working on around and adding a tabular all scalars or CSV mode profile. So I think that's in the works. I don't see Ryan on the call, but we'll keep that updated. And then we have a list of items, mostly from John, that will roll over, I think, to next week, so we can focus this session on OMOP. We've had a couple of ideas out about view definition starting multiple resources, column type, reference implementation, expect columns. I think some of this is coming from testing, schema inference, and we do want to have a more focused session on Parquet. So I think I might have dropped the ball there. So we'll restart that. Maybe we'll set up a new poll to set a date for that. So that's what I had. I just wanted to go over that since for folks joining the call. Anything top of mind for folks right now currently that we should add to the agendas for future meetings? No? Okay, well, just let me know if there's anything top of mind or anything comes up. Or posted in Zulip. So with that, I will hand it over to Nikolai to lead this session. And I think John posted a couple of agenda items as well. So that might be a good place to start.
Thank you, but I'm not sure that I'm the right person. I think Craig has the most of experience. I just did like a couple of investigations. So I don't know, we can walk a little bit so I can show you. Where is it? Yeah, so I just played with a person and we can see what's wrong with it. Yes, so the person ID, it should be big integer. Yeah, it could be hash, but there's still the chance of conflict. The hash, I think, the preferred way to do this, but there still could be the conflict. So the more straightforward implementation could be like having some mapping table. Yeah, like assigning IDs, and we probably can preserve original ID and person source value, and this problem will appear more and more. So we need some special function for that, special table probably. So to be honest, I don't think that like by a mob specification ID should be number, but I'm really interested, is it hard requirement or not, because you're mostly joining, so potentially there is no conflict. So it could be like more relaxed mob version, but it won't work with like standard schemas, yes, where the database already, like tables already created for a mob, so then you could not load. So that's the first element and the first problem. I don't know, we can discuss this, and I think John mentioned this problem about IDs.
I have done this sort of MOP ETL course a few years ago, but I'm a little bit hazy on some of the details. So this identifier really just needs to be unique within the context of this particular data set. Or do we have to have interesting things like, we from one import and then do a subsequent import and match that up to the same ID and potentially merge that in?
I don't think like dictate how it can be done. So as I know from spec, maybe I'm wrong again. So I'm not expert in the mob. So it should be just ID, unique for this person. Yeah, and it should be integer. Yeah, so it is integer. It's not even big integer, but yeah, I think it is integer by.
So we can't even really use a big hash space because it's not even a very big number.
Yeah, so potentially there's a huge risk to. Let's, if we look at the concept IDs, how the OMOP guys treat it, so they really assign the new counter IDs to each concept. So there are no hashing. It makes tables quite compact. Yeah, I would love to meet with experienced OMOP guys, and maybe next meeting we can schedule with some OMOP folks so they can tell us about the real world situation when how they usually map the IDs. They have this person source value, which could be original ID value, yes, and then you can assign some ID. And this ID optimized for joining in OMOP queries. So it is integer, small column size, and stuff like this. So probably the straightforward way, but it's kind of hidden function, user defined. It may have some table behind, like lookup table, which assign the new ID, or hash if the conflict another ID assigned, and something like this. Yeah.
I think so. For the folks who are joining, unfortunately, Craig, who's going to lead this and is more close to the OPOMP community, has some family health issues and couldn't make it. He's going to be out for a couple of weeks. So we're kind of trying to cobble together some things. I think one thing that I know is that there's a current initiative right now from the OMOP community to, best practice mappings from FHIR to the OMOP CDM. So I'm aware of this is sort of an active project going on right now. So I think potentially some of this type low-level mapping would, they're definitely going to be
I visited a couple of meetings of this working group.
Yeah, okay.
So what I saw the scopes they did. So they just created logical model for OMOP, and they not even close to start mapping stuff. I've tried to ask them to start mapping at least concepts. Yeah, I will explain this like in the next topic. So they not even close. So my impression was that we are closer to define OMOP mapping than this working group. And so they spend the year, they defined only logical models for OMOP. It could be generated in one day. So from my point of view, from OMOP metadata, and that's what they have. But they have a OMOP folk, and it would be nice to discuss with them. But yeah, I've tried to propose them to have a meeting together. So that initially I visited a couple of meetings, they didn't give me any chance to explain what we're doing, but we can try again. Maybe on Connected On, I don't know. Just physically come to this group and they will have the way to escape. Yeah.
That's definitely a possibility, and that should be something that we get out of this meeting. Hopefully, is what those next steps are. How do we engage with that group? And I don't have a strong opinion here, but potentially we move this work forward in the way that we feel it seems like the best understanding for us. I know I'm suggesting this is a possible way forward, and then take that to the OMOP group. I'm happy to try and set up something with the OMOP folks as well. But so FYI, I think that's we should figure out what those next steps are in terms of engagement, or at least try to come to some understanding.
There is another project which is called OMOP to FHIR, where the guys serving existing OMOP database through the FHIR API. It's a little bit easier, yes, because you're mapping from like more narrow space to the bigger, but probably so. And I saw the implementation, even a couple of implementation, and that's done by a mob folk. And that's another project we can try to contact with and probably get some ideas or even mappings from there. Yeah, so I can explain that another problem, let's say. So in OMOP, codable concept in a table concept, and it has an ID. An ID is an integer, and you have a reference like gender concept ID. And in OMOP, it should be a standardized concept. So OMOP has a vocabulary. They call it vocabulary, and and you should for elements like gender concept ID, you should pick the standard concept. And for the original value, you may use a gender source value element to map the original value, and gender source concept ID, which is like source concept ID. But again, this is, and OMOP maintain the set of vocabularies as a huge concept table, and it's based on existing, there's a project which is called, I don't know, Athena. Yeah, here it is. Oops. Yeah, so it is open source. It is very nice. I mean that how it's organized from open source point of view. You can load all this stuff and let's say search for male. And we have a standard concept for male. It should be to this vocabulary. And that's a missed, from me, this is a missed part. So ideally, and this is a deal of the OMOP community to map at least standard FHIR value sets or code systems to standard OMOP concepts. Because ideally we should have here the mapping from FHIR gender to standard OMOP gender male. And yeah.
I was just going to say one of the code systems, so the granularity of things to map is not the same. So for example, they have SNOMED in there, but the definition of SNOMED is not the same as the definition of SNOMED in FHIR, so you can't directly map it to. It's almost like an anointed sort of set of versions that have been concatenated together to make SNOMED, and it's the same for other code systems. So it's not as straightforward
it
mapping
is
of, say, URLIs to OMOP systems, I guess.
Yeah, but in general, so let's say then in OMOP, this is a rule that you should map all the concept to the standard concepts. Otherwise, the OMOP doesn't work. Yes, because this is a promise of OMOP. So the write query once and run on different data sets. And that's only can work if you use standardized terminology. And that's why OMOP supporting this standard vocabulary and the mapping from other vocabularies to the standard vocabulary. This is a lot of work, yes, and we can, for gender, it's quite simple. So here you see the OMOP gender and FHIR gender. So we only have on OMOP ambitious and the rest can be mapped easily. But if we go to the race, okay, we have a problem because in let's say in even not just FHIR on US core, we have a like race category and detailed race, and we have a completely different race in OMOP. Yes, so it's smaller than detailed race, but it's bigger than categories. Okay, so even this mapping already should be handled somehow. Yeah, but so my idea that if we look to the OMOP recommendation, how it should be done, it's still the work of OMOP vocabulary. So we should work together, probably FHIR community and OMOP community, but we should provide this mapping stuff into OMOP. We should assign these IDs, concept IDs to FHIR concepts, provide these mappings, and maybe make some decision what should be taken, like how we treat this situation when there is no direct one-to-one mapping. But I don't think this is a rare case for OMOP guys. So they probably encounter such situation a lot, and they have some recommendation how to deal with it. Yes, but again, so we need some OMOP expert who did a lot of ETL pipelines to discuss how this is usually done. But we will definitely lose some information. Or we can probably OMOP, I don't know. This is another topic to discuss with OMOP guys. Could be OMOP extended, as I know it could be extended. Yeah, but how common it is, because again, it's against the general idea of OMOP. Yeah, sorry, John.
Yeah, so my understanding of the way that it's currently done is that you go to this Athena tool, you tick all the boxes for all the things you'd like to download, and you download Athena to your computer. And then they have a tool called Usagi you can load up these Athena vocabulary files into, and you can also load your own data like via CSV, and you can search for concepts in there. And you basically go through and map all your data to the standard concepts. And then this outputs a table format that can load straight into the mapping table of OMOP. So that there's a table in the OMOP schema, which is effectively your local codes to standard OMOP concept IDs mapping. So I had an idea that we could create a support in this Usagi tool to not just create this concept mapping table, but also create a FHIR concept map that maps from the local concept to the OMOP concept. And if you had that FHIR concept map, then you could do things like the translate function within FHIR path to move between those concepts. But I think we need so we could have a system to talk to identify what an OMOP concept is from the FHIR side, potentially, so that we could
use concept maps. But if we look at the stuff from OMOP side, so we see that OMOP prefer to preserve the source concept ID, yes, and all this stuff. So like a clean mapping from my side looks like that it should be done on OMOP side. So we can load concept from FHIR code systems into OMOP, assign concept IDs, and then do the gender source concept ID, populate by FHIR, vocabulary, male, gender concept. Otherwise, this field gonna be empty, and we kind of losing this information, because we could not populate this source concept ID. But so that's my opinion. So ideally, we should populate this, because even if we're losing information on translation, there's still final users can do some stuff with this using original concept ID. And that brings us back to OMOP. If we want to do the same mechanical mapping on the FHIR side, then we need to introduce IDs from OMOP, because IDs are not codes. Or maybe we can treat IDs as a codes, but it requires some investigation. So if we can say that OMOP ID is like a code, So then we can do mapping from FHIR code system to like ID with the system or MOP. I don't know. How technically, John, do you think it can be solved, like source concept ID and how to map to integer ID, how we can translate to integer ID, not coding, but integer ID.
Yeah.
Another problem that when the people are using a MOP data set, they have this concept table alongside, yes, and they use this table for queries.
Yeah. So one approach is to load stuff straight into the tables. The other approach is to build the mapping table and then do the population of the things as a subsequent step, I guess. But yeah, this integer ID thing is a bit of a pain, isn't it?
It is a pain as well, and the final data set MOP should be distributed with the whole terminology as a best practice. Yes, so the whole concept table and even mapping table usually preserve it in data sets, so people can write these queries like using this mapping and concept tables. And that means that we should have like original FHIR concept ID for gender in this concept table, or we will keep this element empty, and this will again, so we're losing information. And there, let's say for race and ethnicity, there is a problem that in FHIR, for example, there are two fields like category and detailed, and in OMOP it's just only one. And you should like make some decision. You initially may try to map from detailed and then fall back to category or logic like this, yeah. And this will bring us to extended FHIR path functionality, so you can write some small logic expression, yes, to do such stuff like trying to map detailed field. If detailed is not present, try to map category field and stuff like this. Yeah, for as well, it needs years and months. I wasn't able to find like functions to extract year and months and day part in FHIR path, but maybe that's because I don't know, maybe it is such function, maybe not. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, that sort of begs the question. Some of those points beg the question of how generalized can this transformation be? Like, are there aspects of it that necessarily need to be configurable? I mean, like, is it possible to do a completely generalized method to get FHIR data into OMOP? Or are there cases where you need to reach into localized extensions, et cetera, to satisfy particular use cases that make it really difficult for that to be a generalized method?
But still, like function like year, months, and day probably worse to exist. I don't know, or like as a date part of I don't remember exactly the name of this function, like extracting part of the date, and I wasn't able to find it in FHIR path. So yeah, and then some stuff which mapped even worse. So let's say there's only one location per person, and in FHIR we have multiple addresses, yes, and it should be, we should put location into location table, and location table doesn't have reference back, so it's one-to-one, not one-to-one, it's one-to-many, and reference coming from person to location. That means we should, again, so we are losing information, we should choose one address. From patient, could it be like home address or like first address or something else? And then location has identity, and we probably need some function like hash the whole address and use it as ID, or again, some mapping logic. So we can get the same ID here. Yeah. Or probably we should put like patient ID, I don't know. So but it's not like one-to-one relation. And with the location, we have a problem that probably different resource types will be mapped to location table. So, and we're getting to the problem that one table should be filled from different resource types. And that's possible extension for SQL on FHIR, that our view definition may support different resource type. We didn't discuss, we shortly discussed this, but as I understand, we decided not to put it into the first version. But it's going to be breaking change if eventually we decide like that we do support multiple resource types for view definition.
But we can do that, right? It's just that it will just be multiple view definitions.
Yeah, it will be multiple view definitions, yes, but yeah, then it's a question how implementation treated, yeah. So if this implementation, let's say, create the view or table, so there is no place to say that these three view definitions should like insert into the same table, yeah. into the same view. Or we can define this somehow in a spec that if you have multiple view definitions, and what is the table name then? The question which not yet solved yet, the ID name of view definition. Yeah.
I think this is raising some of the points that are the first agenda item John put out, which is about, additional FHIR functionality, right? Because one of the things Nikolai is pointing out here, it definitely appears that, additional functionality would be needed in the FHIR subset to do something like this if this is want to perform this within the view definitions and on some other stage of the ETL. So any comments from the group about potential for expanding the set?
Yeah, so I everybody can try to do this exercise. I just spent like a couple of hours and there's a lot of questions. Yeah. And looks like it's not trivial, but it will probably bring us some interesting insights and topics to discuss in our group. Maybe we can make like FHIR functions extensible somehow so people can contribute their own.
So Josh pointed out in the chat that there are some functions for pulling out date components.
Months off. Okay.
Perhaps they should be
part of core or part of FHIR?
It's part of the FHIR path specification itself, not the FHIR extras, but it's probably only defined in the current build. So on build.fhir.org, if you look at the current state of that FHIR path,
I wasn't able to find it. Okay,
yeah, so that's the place to look for kind of the latest set of functions, because the FHIR path specification hasn't been published in several years.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that
link in the Julep chat.
And Josh, could you comment on, if you're aware, which I'm assuming you are, what has changed or what has been added since those versions? Maybe that's not something people are aware of.
Well, if you look through, I'll put the link in. There's a set of functions that are labeled for trial use that are designated as such with a different background color in the spec. So you can see the set of, they're mostly additional functions and in some cases clarifications about behavior.
Yeah, from some other interesting functions, let's say, so we see that in the location there is the address 1 and address 2. In FHIR, this is an array. So one of possible mappings could be like take the first element, put in address 1, and then take from the second element till the end and join it with a string, with a space or something like this. I'm not sure that, I don't know, Josh, do you remember, does FHIR has this ability to take part of array, slice of array?
Well, in many cases, the collections that you use in FHIR path don't have a guaranteed,
that function rest.
The order can come from various places, but you can run a function called take, which will give you a consecutive region, and a function called skip, which will skip over. So you can do that.
Okay.
So the other thing that Craig has raised at previous meetings is that exact use case that you were showing before, Nikolai, where you have lots, particularly in OMOP and probably lots of transformations, is you have this sort of conditional logic looking for things, if using them if they're there, and if they're not, falling back to something else. And this is a really common pattern. And we have things like IIF in FHIR, but that's kind of a bit clunky because you end up with these gigantic cascading trees of things. So I think we've talked before about the need for some other way to do that. Like we've talked about something like coalesce, take the first thing that doesn't evaluate to a null and put it into, I don't think this currently exists in FHIR.
Yeah, I think coalesce you can simulate with a union probably, and taking the first. It's just suggestion. So you can try to take first. If not, you do union. So union may work like coalesce or logical or. Yeah. But it's still open the problem that this FHIR stuff can be very complicated. Yes, and for engines which doing translation to SQL, so that could be the problem, because eventually people end up with doing using the whole FHIR plus extensions to write some transformation. From other sides, so we can consider two-phase transformation. So let's say we're filling some flat and then we do the final transformation using ELT style in database. Yeah. Because the database has a function for extracting date, day, year, months. It has conditional stuff. So, but that said that we could not describe it as a one artifact. Yeah, so it can be described as a chain of transformations. Yeah, but for us, I think this is essential choice. Are we gonna complicate the view definitions or keep it small?
Ryan has a comment in the chat Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, basically just +1 to that last sentiment. I mean, I'd be worried that if we try to do all this in view definitions, especially when we get on all the edge cases and the concept mappings and the merging views and all that sort of thing, it'll become a much larger, more complicated spec, and so yeah, I mean, I'm okay with continuing exploring it. I think that, I mean, if we wanted to do something, make this usable from like an OMOP perspective sooner, then yeah, just creating a series of flattened views as Nikolai had described, and then using some sort of ETL pipeline or like a DBT style pipeline or something like that, I think would work really nicely for that sort of transformation. Once we get all the data that's needed in FHIR, into a flattened format, and then folks can join whatever reference tables they want, map the identifiers to person IDs in whatever way makes sense, and avoid collisions and so on and so forth. Yeah, I feel like it'll be pretty challenging to try do all this in a view definition. Yeah, I'm not sure that the complexity.
But at least this exercise, try to map like a mob, and we can generate a lot of topics to discuss. For example, months off, year off. I would love to see this. It sounds quite reasonable functions for FHIR. Yeah.
Sorry, I always imagined this OMOP transformation to be SQL and FHIR view definitions to a set of intermediate tables, and then pretty vanilla SQL to take it the last step. I wasn't imagining that we would create view definition functionality that would be able to put everything straight into the tables. But I think the goal is to get to the point where the SQL is simple enough that it translates well, and it does all the FHIR specific stuff. I don't think we should get too far beyond that, because if it can be done by standard ANSI SQL, I think then it's fine to do that from an intermediate sort of point, and that preserves the simplicity of our view definitions as well, and lowers the cost of implementation for the view runner.
Yeah, I would support that model as well. And I think that, one thought I had was that, mapping from FHIR to OMOP is just one example, right? One example of a translation from FHIR to, a specified data model, but there'll be more. So let's think of the overall pattern here, because probably similar issues are going to arise. And, if we want to solve them completely within the view definition, like everyone has said, right, it's going to make that there's a power to having that view definition be relatively minimal and simple, right? So not necessarily, and they're great tools for that, for the translation of the intermediate, an intermediate layer. So I think it'd be great to use that pattern, or like explore where the current spec sort of starts to break down, and then have an example using OMOP as that pattern for that first sort of instance of a pattern where SQL and FHIR and view definitions are a part of a chain or an ecosystem. I think that there's value in that. So
this test project then may sound like we're doing like pre-OMOP mapping and then trying to finish it with the SQL. And I like this kind of border. Yeah. So if this can be done with a standard SQL, so probably view definition doesn't have to implement it.
Yeah, but I think
John, go ahead.
I think OMOP is a great use case for this, because I think the schema looks like a typical sort of data warehouse schema that people would be transforming to. And because it's open, there's also open data sets for us to work on. So for example, we can build open source software to transform to OMOP using SQL and FHIR, and we can drive it on things like Mimic 4, which has, a FHIR rendering of it. And we can actually test this on large data sets and actually come out with something useful, because there's other MOP renderings of Mimic 4 to compare to as well that people have done more manually. So I'm super interested in working on open source software to create this. The only thing I'm concerned about is that generalizability problem. So you talked about race, like what race is, like if I'm transforming from some arbitrary data set, and how do we map those guidelines onto this FHIR transformation?
Yeah, that's a good topic. And I think this is a similar challenges which IPS now encounters, yes, because a lot of stuff done in US space, and now people start repeating it in different countries. And let's say this race stuff, yeah, it's gonna happen, yes, on IPS side as well. And Australia decided to introduce race and how it should be mapped to IPS. And as I heard, OMOP is like more international because at least they claim that they handle data sets from different regions. So, but for race, yeah, this is interesting. And I think we will intersect a lot with the IPS, so we can look like more precisely. And this project, yes, so we can try to make this project, let's say, open source DBT and the JavaScript transformer or something like this.
Yeah, so I guess like, is this a FHIR to OMOP conversion, or is there, because FHIR is really lean on this stuff, right? So it doesn't include a lot of things, and there's standard extensions, and there's extensions that are really commonly used, like US Core or perhaps in IPS. And if there's slots in OMOP that are concepts that are not in the FHIR-based specification, then immediately that brings into question our ability to transform from any FHIR. So what assumptions do we have to make about the flavor of FHIR that we are transforming from for the transformation to be able to work?
Yeah, that's a good question, but usually like OMOP much smaller than FHIR, so this is probably like race and ethnicity is a like exception, or probably race and ethnicity should be in a FHIR patient, I don't know. But then at least, yeah, we can do this exercise, but I envision that mostly like FHIR contains OMOP, not vice versa, like that. Not so many stuff where a MOP could not be. Like FHIR is usually more than a MOP, more information than a MOP. But this is a valid question, let's say, for a MOP guy. So if you like location, if you have more information, yes, and you are losing, so how you can deal with it? So OMOP guys care about quality of data, yes, and you're definitely losing information. Let's say you have 3 addresses and then you only want to use 1. And I think that situation should be quite common when you're losing some information from FHIR. And that's probably push OMOP too, because when we discussed with some OMOP guy, he said that, yeah, OMOP, it's a very small, limited, it works, but in the future OMOP should start growing because they incorporate more and more information. And then we should come to and more probably discuss with OMOP guy how they gonna grow. Yes, so I know they added a couple of tables in the future.
Definitely a possibility. I see in the chat that Dan posted a link to the OMOP schema and ETL guidelines. I'm going to bring that up, take a look at it. I see that this is something I haven't seen before, but I think they give some guidance here. Dan, do you have any insight into this?
Not much beyond the link. I've only kind of been peripherally looked at OMOP. So, but they do have like they do have some guidelines here around like, how you map into, we were talking about race and ethnicity, as well as kind of the list of fields and tables. I mean, I think the terminology tables here, like concept, vocabulary, domain, concept class, all can get populated from the Athena download. So I've done that. They have mappings for Postgres and a few other databases, import scripts. And so you basically can recreate the terminology side of OMOP pretty quickly. But then, like some of the earlier discussions, we'd still need to figure out how we get the FHIR concepts mapped to those. That doesn't address that, but it's pretty easy to load the OMOP terminology server tables outside of OMOP.
Got it. So they have tooling support to make that more convenient for folks.
Yeah, so you could kind of load you could load the OMOP terminology tables into your FHIR server pretty easily, but then there's kind of that missing step of how you actually do the mappings between them.
And I think the Athena is a project FHIR should learn from OMOP. Yeah, that's what we missed in the FHIR community.
Well, it seems like we're kind of coming together now, right? In a couple of different angles. So looking through John's list here, so we talked about terminology mapping. I think, we're point to continue. Talked about FHIR path functionality. Any comments before we move the last bullet from the team?
Well, yeah, should for example, translate be part of our sort of optional FHIR path functionality? We've already got member of there. It seems like this is a pretty common requirement, even outside of OMOP.
And for folks who are not versed in FHIR path, what does translate do?
Translate is not actually a direct FHIR path function. There's some sort of analog for it under the % terminologies namespace in FHIR path. But the idea of it is that you can take an input concept and translate it to a set of concepts based on a map, and the implementation details of that are sort of hidden. But, you can imagine that one sort of way of doing that would be to look up a table, for example, in OMOP with source and target concepts. Another implementation would be to go to like a FHIR terminology server and use the translate operation for FHIR terminology to do that. But it might be useful to have the ability within a view definition to translate from source concepts based on some known mapping.
Any thoughts from the group about, considering adding translate?
John, is it generalized function translate anything to anything, or it's just applicable to like coding and terminology?
Well, concepts have to be characterized as a coding, if you're talking source FHIR, that you've already put stuff into a coding, and then on the other side you need to characterize it as a coding. So for example, if it was OMOP, I imagine you would have to take a source coding and emit like an Athena concept potentially, or an OMOP concept, or whatever is the right way to refer to that. But I think there's the issue of FHIR path itself, which doesn't actually contain, it has a sort of percent terminologies way of doing translation, which is a bit clunky. So we would possibly have to use that, or propose, a way to do translate, inline, coding, or codable concept dot translate. I was just thinking of that as a possible solution to the example you were showing before, where we need to populate both the source value and the translated value when you run it through, say, mappings that you've created from your data to OMOP. Or we just completely descope that part and sort of say, just leave it blank and you handle that in your sort of intermediate to OMOP step.
Yeah, and maybe like trying to think through some of the principles that we could use to make these decisions. It's like, so maybe I'll toss like a straw person proposal out there. And what could be is like, if somebody has a bunch of FHIR data sitting in some FHIR server, they want to ultimately get it into OMOP, but presumably like our FHIR views implementation should be, specification and implementation should be something that is reasonably easily implemented, on that FHIR server. And so the more we add to this sort of, so the more we shift from the post FHIR views transformation and into this spec, the harder it will be to implement. And then like in this case kind of pops up a little bit along those lines, because if we add this translate function, it's a custom FHIR path function, which, isn't a huge deal, but perhaps more complicated is like the FHIR server itself will need to have the concept maps between the FHIR code values and the, OMOP code values that are used there, which is perhaps a lot to ask from that server and would reduce adoption. So maybe one thing we could consider in terms of what how do we make these decisions is just things that try to constrain capabilities of view definitions to the things that could be implemented relatively easily across a broad set of FHIR infrastructure. And so this to me implies this might be better as a post-processing step.
In my opinion, so we can try to keep the current spec as minimal as possible, but we can still allow some extensions from implementations, like in CSS style, border, something like this. So people can try to introduce some new function. And if this function will prove that they really useful, yes, so we can like get this function in the next releases. So that implementation can still kind of say, okay, I have this like my proprietary extension, yes, but which in future probably may become the part of the standard. So I would love to have something like this, like extensibility in this point, so people can try the new function, like let's say in puzzling this translate already implemented, so and we can see and we can give the users the way to try, and if they really like it, if it works, so why we can discuss it and decide that, okay, so now it's a part of the spec. But we can like by default, try to keep it as simple as possible. Let's say the same about the year and the months. So we can like have a way to add the new stuff in incubation, I don't know, functions or something like this, maybe with some prefixes so people understand they're using incubated functions. So
yeah, it's a little bit similar to the conversation we had last week about tags. Yeah, and I think similar kinds of concerns about like implementations sort of forking by extension, which is something that I think we want to avoid. This is a bigger topic for sure. I'm not going to get very far, I think, in 3 minutes, but wanted to put it out to the group as an idea if you have any sort of initial reactions to that concept.
Yeah, I feel like we haven't quite grounded out the whole optionality piece in the spec. So, we have, for example, member of, which is an optional thing. And we also don't say much about like fire path that is not in the core set and what the expected behavior is. So if somebody, for example, creates a view definition that includes functions that are not in the core set, then what's the behavior? Do we sort of have like, should implementations warn you? Should it knock it back? What happens if we get these view definitions floating around with sort of functionality that's not really part of the core spec, that's kind of not runnable by some implementations and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, I think this opens up a lot of topics, definitely. So maybe this should be a discussion point to John's point that, we focus on a little more specifically in one of these calls and talk about optionality. I like that example of, having FHIR path that's outside of the core spec because, it's open source software, right? Implementations can do, if you're just doing implementations in-house, which is a possibility.
Yeah, I like it's done in JSON schema, yes. So in JSON schema, they have a lot of draft keywords and only like half of them are accepted as a part of the spec, yes. But the rest still has a test cases and all this stuff and discuss it. And so that would be nice. So at least if we decided not to accept translate, we can describe it as not even like optional, but as a draft function, which completely not required, but we have a test for that and a separate folder. We have a definition for that. So if we eventually decided it should be like this, so we can just move it from one folder to another folder and it works.
Anybody have any quick thoughts or reactions to that idea? I think this should be an agenda item that we talk about in a lot more detail. Is that good with everyone? All right. So I see we're at time, but thank you everyone for joining and Nikolai for leading this conversation. I think there's definitely conversations to come specifically around OMOP and then the other items that we talked about.
Thank you guys. Have a good day.
Thanks everybody. See ya.